Our next session is a panel made up of 4 great leaders in different parts of the health and community sector here in Toronto. To introduce that panel, let me first introduce to you its moderator, Adelstein Brown. He is the director of the Institute for Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the Dalla Lana School at the University of Toronto. He is the chair in Public Health Policy, as well as head of the Division of Public Health Policy. He is presently a scientist at the Keenan Research Center at Li Ka-shing at St. Mike's as well. And in the past, the not-so-recent past, he was also an assistant deputy minister in the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care with responsibility for strategy and policy. Steny, we're glad to have you with us this morning.
So the one problem with being a very tall white guy is the seats never fit. So if I tumble over, maybe someone can hear you. Is that better? Great, thanks. I was just saying that one of the problems of being a tall white guy is that the seats don't fit. So if I fall over, somebody maybe will come and get me. And if you're wondering, I am taller than Bob Bell, but I have no useful skills. Look, I'm making a couple jokes because I actually found this morning very uncomfortable. And for exactly the reasons that Kwam stated. These are facts and stories and statistics that sit very, very heavily on you. And I think back to the legacy of my grandparents and the legacy of my parents. And I sometimes feel a little bit like I'm failing if I'm not doing enough here. It's perhaps an odd thing for someone to say, but I'll tell you first the story of my grandmother. And before I introduce the panelists, I'm going to take the privilege of being up here to tell you the story about what I see in the data now. So it's an interesting story, but my grandmother came to this country just during the First World War. And she actually escaped from where she was. That's kind of a funny thing for someone like me to say, but my grandmother was indentured. And this was very common in the country where she came from because the poverty was so endemic that you saw diseases like Favis. If there's any docs here who deal with the hardest communities in our world, Favis is something you don't even see in our poorest communities anymore. But children were sold off at a young age to go work in other people's families because the inequity and because the poverty was so significant. And yet, when she came here, she had a much different life. And she has a son who gets to take this wonderful privileged position at a university, who's had all these great luxuries and privileges in life. And I do find this uncomfortable, Kwam, but it's probably a good discomfort. Let me talk a little bit, though, about the data. And maybe I'll finish with a story about my mother. So, Kwam, as is right for a doctor, dispensed some very strong medicine today. But like a good doctor, he did it in a way that we can stomach it. And when you look at the data, it gets to be one of these challenges of almost a monolithic impression of inequity. And it's there. But I want to pick up on something else he said because I think it's an important corrective and criticism of how we think about stuff. He talked about our unassuming, modest nature as Canadians, right? We tend not to stand up and cheer, and I always like to tell the story that if you watch the Olympics, the Canadian who gets a gold medal will kind of look down and kind of ashamed of winning when he gets interviewed. And the person from the States who gets the silver will say, "Yeah, it's silver, it's fantastic." And the Canadian's like, "Well, gold still could have gone somewhere else." But it means we tend to look too far afield for our solutions. We tend to look somewhere else. And in some ways, I think this contributes to this bystander effect. So when you dig down into some of the data that Kwam showed, you'll see 2 things. First, that in a lot of places, inequity is getting worse. When you dig down into communities and places and the ways that we divide our society, inequity is actually getting worse. But if you look carefully, there's actually places inside of Ontario where inequity is getting better. Not because generally type 2 is moving into a type 1 town or anything like that, but actually that there are things that can be done that can correct inequity. And I think it's important to pull out that aspect of the data as well. Because when we look to think about what we could do better. This isn't about looking at Kaiser or looking at the UK or looking at one of these wonderful lionized examples that exist somewhere else in a different context that is easy to put to the side. It's actually here. And I think this is important because it sharpens the moral imperative of what we have to do. Because it's not just we should do better, it's actually we can do better. And it's not an issue of figuring out how to change all of these things and somehow, what was the story there, the Big Bang sort of thing that will change everything. Actually, it's just a matter of choosing something from a list, and we can start to make things better. I'm going to just stop there with a story about my mother, and it may sound odd to talk about my mother when we talk about inequity. My mom developed her fourth cancer about 12 years ago. She's a good fighter, good strong genes, fourth primary. That's actually a pretty good record to have lived through 3 different primary bouts of cancer. And she got a particularly ugly form of cancer, peritoneal carcinoma, that's rare and ugly and probably has something to do with a little bit of a gene line. Now, she got great treatment in our system. They debulked the tumor. It's an awful term. They gave her radiation, and never going to be cured, but a chance to see a few things. So she went, her doctor moved away, and she got a new doctor, and she sat down, and the doctor said, okay, so what are you looking for? And I should put context here. I'm in the Ministry of Health at that point. My mother's a highly educated, highly articulate woman, a nurse who'd actually been the director of nursing at a large teaching hospital. My father's a professor of neurology. I promise not neuro-ophthalmology, neurology. And a prominent doctor. We're all sitting there. So my mom says, I'd really like time. My son's not married yet. He doesn't have kids. I'm a little worried about him. I'd like to see stuff get sorted out. But here's the kicker. The doc looked at her and said, well, with people in your sort of position, we go to palliative care. And my mom said, I don't want palliative care. I'd like to do as extreme a set of stuff as we can do so I get time. I'm willing to trade time for quality. The doc looked at her and said, well, I think palliative care is right. And so we're lucky enough, this is the other side of the inequity story, we're lucky enough that we could move her care. We're lucky enough we could find another doctor. We had that good fortune in our society. And she lived long enough, a lot longer than anyone expected, and I got married and I had kids and I got stable employment and that sort of stuff. But it's this point about listening to people and really listening to people. And I think this is something that isn't just about learning to listen to one group. It's making sure that every encounter we have with our system, we actually listen to what people are trying to tell us. And to pick up on the very good point that was made earlier on, I think if we actually start listening, we'll see much more of the reality behind the data. And so I think hopefully this sharpens both the moral imperative and maybe sort of puts a little bit of a human picture on some of the stuff that I know many people could do much more profoundly and much better. All right, with that, it's my real pleasure to introduce 3 local people. We can look locally for the solutions, to come up and join me. I think you've got bios in the packages. Those bios themselves are all far too short and skip on these people's accomplishments. So I won't talk too much about that, but let me first welcome Dr. Gary Newton to the stage. Gary is the Chief Medical Strategy Officer at the Sinai Health System. He is the Chief of Staff at Mount Sinai Hospital. Someone who's championed issues around data and actually figuring out what we know is going on. Please welcome Dr. Gary Newton. I'm going to now welcome someone to the stage I've had the pleasure twice now in the last year of sharing a stage with, and that's Angela Robertson. Angela, again, has one of these sorts of paragraph, nice, modest Canadian biographies that should be about 3 or 4 more paragraphs longer. She's the executive director at the Central Toronto Community Health Centres and has a litany, a very nice litany of trail of honors and recognitions and awards and leadership roles behind her. So please welcome Angela Robertson. And third, I'd like to welcome Medhat Nadi to the stage. Medhat's someone who has, I think, worked or been engaged with the Y your entire life. He's Executive Director of the Greater Toronto Area YMCA. And again, someone who I think has recognized not just how to run something, how to make sure it makes a contribution to a committee, but has really recognized how we have to join up a whole bunch of the opportunities and powers that we have in our society to get healthy people. Please welcome Madam. Okay, my only other challenge today is to keep people disciplined, keep the conversation flowing. I've got a fairly long arm. I can probably reach you, Gary, if you get over time. But I'll just look uncomfortable and start to cough and do the typical Canadian thing if you get over time. Gary, please.
Good morning. I've been very much enjoying this morning's session, and I'm very much a newcomer to health equity and diversity, meaning I did my academic career as a cardiologist, and then cardiac leadership, and then medicine leadership, and now hospital leadership. And only in the last 2 years was I invited to join the Human Rights and Health Equity Committee, led by Marilyn Caney and our Sinai group. Yay. And that was my introduction. In many ways, I am your challenge, in that I exist day to day in a world, in an environment for which health equity is not regularly discussed. I'm struck when I drive my car back to work, the other pressures facing myself and my institution can overwhelm in a minute, from budget to meeting other metrics of performance to meeting our quotas, etc. And this can become what it is not, but it can become perceived as a niche area. And I'm here with a very specific lens, leadership in the acute health sector, conventional hospitals, a University Avenue academic hospital. The ministry has given us enormous resources on a scale that would make many agencies in this room drop their jaws, because that's what it takes to run an acute care hospital. And our challenge is, and it's not answered yet, is how do we participate in this space? How do we make this set of questions not a question for this room, but a question for the executive council of my hospital, for every department that meets, for every managing group that meets? How does equity become as fundamental to how we deliver care and how we measure care as is length of stay and repeat hospitalization? We haven't solved that. I don't think anyone in the province has. Some very early comments, and then I'll stop right there. Number one is I'm on the executive council and I'm a rank and file member of the committee. I think that's a crucial first step. I think the executive of institutions has to be present in the inner workings of the diversity, human rights, health equity entity within institutions. Number two is data. I'm in the middle of hearing this spectacular data collection. It's an amazing first step, but it is a first step. It only lives within institutions. We don't share it the way we share other data, and we haven't linked it the way we link other data that we're comfortable with to places like ISIS and CIHI to really make dramatic inferences that will push us. And number three relates to number two. That data has to embed itself not just in lines on health equity for HQO, but has to embed itself in terms of hospital performance remuneration across the board to become part and parcel of how we do our business. I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you. Angela?
So I'm going to leave staying, you see, so that the long reach of the arm, and really want to say it's absolutely fantastic to be in this room with a community of friends and really comrades, because I see in the room a number of folks who we've been on this journey towards this location around having concentrated conversations around advancing health equity. And I think your presence here speaks to, I think, your tenacity in remaining unrelenting until the system also came to this issue. I want to quickly, in my 10 minutes, kind of just quickly locate myself. So really, I think what informs and what drives why I am the way I am, why I do work the way I am, and why I'm so committed to this issue is that I'm the child of an immigrant. So my mother came here as a domestic worker in what was then the Caribbean Domestic Worker Scheme, which is now the Living Caregiver Program. And I remember working and wanting to work as quickly as I could get my social assistance number, because that would relieve burden and responsibility on her to buy me stuff. And at that time, there was a thing called Byway. You remember Byway, right? The precursor to Zellas. And for others, Woolworth in another location was another place. And I remember working early in high school and in a nursing home. So you'd start at 7. And what struck me always was the fact that on the first Dufferin bus, all of the folks who took that bus looked like me. They were brown-skinned, they were immigrant, they were accented. And I thought that there was something happening here, because I know that we were heading off to workplaces where we were being paid meager resource, but working significantly long hours. So I provide this just as a little bit of a backdrop to what brings me to this work, and therefore ask you as leaders in this room to ask yourself, what is it that brings you to inspire you to do the work of equity and to advance the work of equity? And it may not be housed in your own personal lived experience, but it may be based on things that you have witnessed. So Stanius shared his. I'm also here, I think, really congratulating the Lynn, because I remember when Gail Peach and many of you here were there then, in 2000, and I think it may have been 4, at the Rico Coliseum, where we were asked to identify top 10 priorities, integration priorities for the newly developing Lynn. And back then in 2004, we had identified access to services for racialized and marginalized communities. That was then the language for health equity before we arrived here. So we've been on this journey for a long time. Others of you here remember way back when with Ruth Greer. Now, this is a whole other era for some. In the 90s, where Ruth Greer's leadership gave us what we still have as an Aboriginal healing and wellness strategy. I share these kind of pieces of historical moments to also say that we are here with also a certain degree of impatience, because we have been here long enough, and while we do not have the full body of evidence, and while we may not have the full scope of data, I think we do have enough to act. So when we talk about health equity, we also must be talking about responsiveness to the services and to the people's needs. I will skip over all of the data piece because Kwam and others have located that, but I will leave one piece of data, which is StatScan shows that across Toronto in 2012, almost 40% of the city's 140 neighborhoods have child poverty rates of 30% or more. But neighborhood disparity varies dramatically, from 5% in Leaside, Lawrence Park, the Kingsway, to 50% or more in Regent Park, Moss Park, Thorncliffe Park. And the residents in those communities are African, Asian, Middle Eastern, Caribbean, from Latin American backgrounds. So we also know that there's a racialization of poverty that's happening here, and we know that child poverty is not distinct and separate from the poverty of their parents. I firmly believe that in our transformational healthcare system and sector, when we talk about leadership, is that for we to be accredited as leaders, health equity must be one of the key pillars in our organization if we truly need to advance what we call the patient-centered, the patient care agenda, which is back to Stani's comment about listening to the patient. That is the patient care agenda. I do not believe we can deliver on this if leaders are not defining and driving equity as a priority and not seeing it as a key enabler to achieving excellence and excellent care for all. There is often reluctance in taking up the health equity agenda, and it's often characterized by reflections such as, the issue is not relevant for us because diverse populations is not reflected in our catchment or in our program area of delivery and or in our area of specialization. That we do not have enough data to take action. That we cannot serve everyone or be everything to everyone. So hence, we don't start anywhere. Or that work is beyond our mandate. Or our work is to provide medical services, not social service intervention. Or we do not have an inequality or a discrimination issue, we have an access issue. I pause here on the question of discrimination, as often when this issue gets named in a Canadian context, and we've heard about our politeness, many decision makers tune out and get exasperated because there's a sense of futility and a general weariness about race and marginalization being used to promote or demand, quote unquote, special attention for some. But I believe until leaders across health system sectors can proactively name and respond to this issue, we will waste precious time wading through denial and defensiveness, which I think will only exacerbate the problems. As leaders and organizations, we need to address the social determinants of health. Gary talked about that, issues of poverty. We need to address the issues of social determinants of equity, and we need to also include discrimination as one of the elements that we need to respond to. As leaders, our task must be to put equity on the agenda and name inequality as a force determining the distribution of social determinants of health. We must routinely monitor for differential exposure, opportunities, outcomes by specific population, and we've heard about the data collection project and the need to have disaggregated information so we can measure equity, and I see the movement. We must continually ask, how is inequality and disparity operating here? And in response, we must identify structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that exacerbate these disparities and tend to them. And we must attend to both what exists and what is lacking in our organization, and we must fill those disparity gaps. We must also monitor and see in our organizations and services who we are seeing, but more importantly, who are we not seeing? And oftentimes we say, well, our population is only reflective of the demographic that we live in. And I often ask, but who is missing? Because we know that there are pockets of inequalities in the communities where we reside. To take this home and a bit closer, I mean that hospital discharge planning processes and administrators need to be concerned that patients are discharged to conditions of absolute homelessness or precarity in housing. That poor families on fixed income are being discharged with medication with instructions to take 3 times a day after each meal, when we know from some of the information that for three meals for some is a luxury. I'm not suggesting that it is the health sector's responsibility to solve all of these problems, but I'm saying that it is our responsibility to not ignore the problem and to use our strength as health leaders to support efforts that demand equitable income and affordable housing. It also means that for this system of transformation, you cannot have one part of the system restricting eligibility to unemployment insurance, the other cutting health care for refugees, the other restricting access to social assistance, and or creating other kind of limiting policies and structures. Hence, no one then becomes responsible for anything. And back to the question, I think the comment that was made earlier, hence the need for us all to be in some collaborative effort. And I will just wrap up quickly. I believe that special programs and projects are important, but in a city with this diversity and inclusion cannot be a pilot project. It cannot just be a project or a satellite. It needs to become an integrated part of the work we do. It doesn't mean that we don't start small, but I think we need to end big. Last two comments, hence the distance. When we need to recognize also that we often use diversity as a code. We use diversity as a code for race only, as if racial identity can be inextricably linked to gender, sexual identity, class, location, ability, status, etc. And therefore, I will go back to Lana's comment about intersectionality, is that I am more than Angela the immigrant, I'm Angela the woman, I'm Angela who belongs to an LGBT community, I'm Angela whose mother was a single parent. So we need to recognize how these circles are interlinked. I will leave by saying health equity is the realization by all people of the highest attainable level of health, and achieving health equity requires valuing all individuals and populations equally. This entails focused and ongoing societal efforts and leadership to address avoidable inequalities by assuring the conditions for optimal health for all groups, particularly for those groups who have experienced historical or contemporary injustices, as was the comment from the floor around Aboriginal communities in this country, and the fact that this is Aboriginal people's country and that their marginalization was manufactured by the state. We must remember as leaders that there is no equity in creating equity for some and leaving inequality in the path of others. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Great. Thanks, Angela. And I promise I was taking notes. I wasn't getting jumpy. Medhat?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. So I'm using the podium not to be away from Staney, but because I'm actually a very strong introvert. And the podium is my security blanket. And if you could imagine an introvert speaking to over 250 people, you could imagine how nervous and intimidated I might feel. Not just because I'm an introvert, but because of the quality and the competence of all the people in the room, people on the panel, and many of the people that we heard. So I'm truly humbled and privileged to be here with you. I'm going to do three things. One is I'm going to tell you a bit why I think I was invited to this in the first place. Secondly, tell you a little bit about the why and the vision that we're undergoing and the transformation we're going through. Whatever you think the why is, it's changing. And third, some of my learnings as the CEO of the largest and most diverse Y in the world in trying to lead change. It's been a challenge leading change in a successful organization because we are what I would call burning platform people. Give us a burning platform in the organization and we'll galvanize. But what I've been able to do is to convince my colleagues, our board, that the burning platform is in the community. And if we don't deal with that burning platform and we're not part of it, we will all not benefit. And there's no need for me to repeat all that's been said around equity, around inequities, around racism. It's all fairly prevalent. And then I'll finish off by sharing personally why I'm very committed to this cause. So just to give you a quick picture, the YMCA of Greater Toronto is in 5 regions. It's the Greater Toronto YMCA. We're in 380 locations across the GTA. We have multiple services that we offer, everything from childcare, camping and outdoor education, employment programs, immigrant settlement programs, youth substance abuse programs, counseling, shelters, you name it. If there's a need in the neighborhood or in a community, we'll be there. And of course, we're known for operating gyms and pools and health and fitness programs, which is a big part of what we do. So that's the YMCA of Greater Toronto. April of 2010 was a very exciting day for our Y. At least I like to say it was very exciting. We had a board meeting, and at that board meeting, our board approved a new strategic plan called Strong Start, Great Future. They also approved my appointment as CEO. So, and I remember that day, my family came to Canada as immigrants. My mother is in a facility and she wasn't doing very well, but I went up to her and I went to see her and I said, "Mama," and she said, "What, Sonny boy?" My mother calls me Sonny boy, which is Arabic for Sonny boy. And by the way, only my mother can call me Sonny boy. But she said, "What, Sonny boy?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'm now the president of this organization that I've worked with for over 30 years." She looked up at me and she only had one thing to say: "It's about time." I'm not sure whether that was a comment on me or the organization. But Strong Start, Great Future, a wonderful brand for our strategic plan, and the vision in that plan was that our communities will be home to the healthiest children, teens, and young adults. We looked at all the data you've looked at, but we also looked at how it applied to children, teens, and young adults. It was a very exciting vision, very compelling vision. But also, if you really take it seriously, it requires incredible transformational change. Because if you think about the vision statement, our communities will be home to the healthiest children, teens, and young adults. It's the first vision statement we've had that doesn't mention the YMCA. And all of a sudden, from thinking about who we are and how we're going to grow, and we're going to grow, we're thinking about outside in, what issues in our community can we help to address? And we felt this was an area that we needed to be a big part of. And so that's been driving transformational change. And I know the topic is to talk about leadership and change and culture change. And what I did as a typical introvert is I brainstormed with myself and came up with my learnings as we've been going through this transition. So the first thing around this is having an evidence-based, compelling vision is really, really critical. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out why this was the right vision for the community and for the why at this time, and projecting forward. It's a 10-year strategic vision. So having a compelling vision that's based on evidence, for me, was the first step. A second thing, if those of you who haven't read Margaret Wheatley's work, I remember reading an article by her around the importance of courage and fearlessness. And so if we're going to take on a bold, compelling vision, we need to have courage and fearlessness, and it has to start with me as the CEO. So early on, I had to stick my neck out on a whole bunch of things. Another thing is I realized early on that people have a certain perception of the why, internally and externally, and that we needed some signs of change. So I'll give you 3 examples of signs of change that I introduced early on. One is the Central Y, which is on Grosvenor Street. You're probably all familiar with it. When you go to the Central Y, you see the city under one roof. We invested in transforming it into what we call a center of community. So originally it was a gym and a pool. It now has a newcomer center, has a childcare, it has a family resource center, it has a youth zone, it has public space, it has community space, it has the gym, the pool, the conditioning room, it has a green roof, and it has a high school for kids with learning disabilities. And so this concept of bringing wraparound services under one roof was really important. And it was a physical manifestation of the change we needed to go through. And that was really, really important. Now, co-location doesn't make it a center of community. So the next challenge was to get the people who are working in a center to work horizontally together, thinking about who's coming to the center and not what program they're delivering. And that's been a process that so far has been making good progress. The second one was a really big one. In our why, we have what we call circle time, which is we discuss things, and we have triangle time, which is decision is made. I encourage, with my team, diversity of opinion, but I don't tolerate division. So once we've had the conversation, we move forward. So we said, I said, we're going to have a thing called teen nights in every one of our 8 big centers. On a Saturday night, any teen in the community can come to the Y for free. And the programs will be organized by teen councils. Since we launched that program, we've seen 50,000 different teens have come to that program, and 30% are still involved. And many of them become teen leaders, teen councils. So we use it as an opportunity to help develop progressive leadership development. And the third is we said we would build 10 new Ys in 10 years. We now call it 10 and 10-ish. And that was going to require $250 million. And we've never done that before. But we made sure that the first one we opened in January is called the Vanoli Street YMCA, which is at Queen and Spadina in the Alexandra Park, and is a center of community for street-involved and homeless youth. And under one roof, we have a 40-bed shelter, we have a drop-in, we have laundry facilities, we have a kitchen, we have other agencies that come in to provide services, we have substance abuse programming, we have a pre-employment program. But it's not just the center that was different. It was also how we built it, because we're committed to community engagement. So when we did the first architectural drawing for the center, we took it to the youth who are homeless and using the center. And they basically told us it sucked. And they told us why it sucked, because we had put the shelter in the basement. So to make a long story short, we redesigned the whole center based on what we heard from the youth. So the shelter is now on the 2nd floor with lots of light. They gave us 4 themes that we needed to take into account: dignity, safety, respect, and hope. And we made sure that we implemented the design to those 4 themes. Because we have a commitment now that just because you're homeless or street involved, you should not have to suffer with lack of quality facilities, programs, or services. You have just as much right to the person, the businesswoman, who comes to one of our health and fitness centers. So that was a big investment and a big change in how we did things. So those kinds of things communicated a change in how we were doing our work. Now, none of these were without resistance, but I also know that we're in a good place because I've visited 100 of our sites and met with about 1,000 staff. The second last thing I will say is that as a leader, I realize that people pay attention to what you do, what you talk about, and how we allocate resources. So it was really, really important for us as leaders. One of my biggest aha moments was this notion that I could tell you lots of stories about how we've helped people beat the odds, but it's also about figuring out how to change the odds. And one of the things I share with my staff is Nelson Mandela's quote that it always seems impossible until it's done. Personally, I'm very committed to this vision. My family came here. We had to sneak out of Egypt because my dad disagreed with the Egyptian government. We hid out in Germany for about 9 months, wound up in Canada, in Toronto. And I have a great love for my home country, but for Canada and Toronto. We, as a family, we benefited from great privilege. We came here with no money, and we have great privilege now. But I always remember John Kennedy's quote that our privileges should never exceed our obligations. So out of love for this city and this community and the people who come here, I'm very committed to making this vision come true.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely.
So part of what I'm supposed to do up here is ask you a few questions. So I'm going to start with a question about tipping point. And so, I think we said earlier on, we have a law. In fact, we have several laws that say we're supposed to be focused on equity. So it isn't that we haven't said it's important. But when you look around, there's some organizations that have started to pay attention to equity. There's individuals who've gotten on the bus, but then there's lots of folks who haven't. So how do we get to that tipping point? How can we accelerate that process so that everyone sees this as truly a common cause and not, so that we don't celebrate the examples as opposed to the average? Yeah, it's an easy question. So.
Yeah. I think leadership, number one, not just leadership in organizations, but political will, and what we talk about, what we focus on, and not being afraid to confront the brutal facts before us, but realizing what was said earlier, that we have the capacity, if we coordinate and leverage what we have, to make a difference. So I think leadership is critical, I think, and both on the political side and the organizational side.
Right. Angela?
And I would build on the political will, because I think we live in election cycles, which are really 3 years. And because delivering on equity is really a longer-term project, it mutes sometimes our ability to make political commitments to delivering on the evidence that we see coming out of the 3 city reports and all others. So I think that as organization leaders, we are not bound by the 3-year cycle. So I think there is that it's incumbent upon us to see this, I think, as the tipping point moment, given all of the data that I think was just presented, and to make longer-term commitments, recognizing that, yes, we will continually struggle with the 3-year political cycle, but I think it shouldn't hinder us from making longer-term commitments in delivering on equity. And I think that's a challenge for us as leaders to really think to think beyond the political cycle.
All right. Thanks.
In the healthcare sector, I think we actually are at a moment of incredible opportunity. The new model of how we're funded, health system funding reform, has changed everything. Institutions only a few years ago got a big pot of money and did what they wanted. Now, if only 30 cents on the dollar comes to hospitals for infrastructure, 70 cents on the dollar is given to institutions based on what they do, their volumes, their quality, their costs. So there are now levers to change. This is a massive opportunity to embed equity in telling institutions what they need to do. The one misperception is that institutions are monolithic and slow and can't move quickly. Anything but that. And these big institutions can change on a dime if they need to. From a medical perspective, if a new widget or treatment is better, even if it costs too much, wait 3 years and the whole system changes. So I'm not all that pessimistic that we could not do the same for equity if the powers that be not just valued it, but demanded it and prioritized it in terms of how they paid us.
Sure. So let me pick up on a little bit of a theme here that's running across all of it, but I want to introduce a word that's a very common word in health policy here, and that's accountability, right? So we've had some accountability for cost, we're getting to some accountability for quality. Why don't we have accountability for equity yet? Why don't we sort of find ourselves asking the deputy minister to say, here's your measure for equity?
So I think we don't have accountability for equity because we, sector, and I say myself in that sector, we've been allowed to argue ourselves out of being accountable. And what we have used in making that argument is that there isn't data to set benchmarks to identify what the indicators, appropriate indicators should be, that we should be measured against and held accountable against. And therefore, we need the data first, but then we argue that the way we are collecting the data isn't the way that the data should be collected because it won't give us what we need to make the benchmark to produce. So I think we have really done a bit of a circular argument to argue ourselves out of being accountable. I think one of the ways that we're moving to is the embedding equity in the quality agenda. And I think the other lever that we've started is around the Excellent Care for All piece of legislation. And I think the next drive is how do we bring equity into this element called the patient-centered care. And if we are able to identify that using some of the existing information we have, then to identify indicators, then I think we can really hone in on identifying some key metrics. The Power study identified all kind of health equity indicators that I think we can begin to move incrementally on in integrating in our accountability agreements.
Medhed, you've made this internal accountability for you on this.
Yes.
Yes, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, I mean, health is an investment, and we view it as a cost. And I think if we're talking about upstream, how much are we putting into the upstream side versus the downstream side? So whenever I hear talk about health and health costs, I don't hear the talk around the upstream investment side. The second thing is, you know, I'm fortunate in an organization where I can take some risks. And one of the things I'm trying to introduce is don't be afraid to fail. Try something. If it doesn't work, let's learn from it. And there's this fear of failure, and this fear of failure drives wanting to get everything perfect right away before we take action. And one of the phrases we use is called GEPO, good enough, push on, and try it. And so there's some cultural issues we have in institutions where we really need to try things, take some risks, and follow through on them.
Great. Okay, I want to challenge one more sort of thing I've heard today. And I've served 6 different ministers, and every time I use the phrase, it's complicated and it's going to take a long time, there's a sort of a moment of seizure, and then they shift the attention away from me and they look at someone else. But you know, they're kind of human that way, right? Like that, I do the same thing. My 7 and 8-year-old daughter do it all the time, right? Why do we say it's going to take a long time? Aren't there things we can do now? I'm thinking about Gary talking about some very concrete things early on. Can't we hang our measure of success on things that could be better tomorrow, could be better the next month, could be better next year?
The data we're collecting now is good enough, meaning we can have another symposium and work for days to make it better, and then we'll have another one and make it better. Good. That's a mug's game. Fundamental data is being collected, and I think we probably need to draw a line in the sand and say, this is good. It's sufficient. Next steps have to happen. Next steps are sharing data. So community health centers, health hospitals in our LIN are collecting their data, living in their EMR. It's not pooled like it would be in CIHI or other registries. Mm-hmm. So there is no benchmarking to understand who we are and what we do and who we serve compared to others. We need to continue to figure out how to collect the data everywhere, but we need to jump right to next steps and figure out how to move the data to sharing, to generalization, and then in terms of accountability and getting on with it, setting benchmarks. Now, you can have meetings about benchmarks, but ultimately someone just has to set them. Yeah. And after a year, that's what we have to target.
Great, good.
I would say a challenge we run into is funders and donors who want a guarantee of success. And if we're gonna pilot, if we're gonna try things, are they willing to stick their neck out with me and with our organization as we're trying things? So I think there is this sort of culture around wanting guaranteed success to a large degree. And then we talk a lot about collaboration and the impact it can have. But good collaboration requires backbone structures and support. And are people willing to invest in that? So I think there's a number of different things we need to look at.
Okay. Angela, last comment to you.
And I think that when we take on the work long term is, I think, an acknowledgement that advancing equity, responding to inequality is messy business. It creates moments of disquiet. It's not about everybody coming and being happy. It's about recognizing that you're talking about folks who have been excluded, and therefore when folks who have been excluded and marginalized come to the table and come into conversation, is that there will be a display, and we will expose. It's no longer held resentment. It will just be overt statement of dissatisfaction about what has existed. So I think when we seek to tackle health equity issues, is simultaneously, we must also say, this is going to be messy.
Yeah.
This is going to create moments of disquiet and discomfort, and that is part of the process. It's not about designing a work plan to exclude that messiness, because that will never happen, because that's a sanitized process. That's really about containment.
Right.
It's not about real change.
Great. Okay, so admittedly, it's a long journey. We got models here. The data's good enough to use.
Yeah.
People are ready for accountability around equity. Susan, I think you've got a mandate. Great. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Thanks, everyone. It's a great talk.
Okay.
Thank you.